So we are here because of the E.H.Zero project. And the E.H.Zero project stands for Grand Rapids Policies and Programs for Equitable, Healthy, Zero Carbon Buildings. This is a project going on between the City of Grand Rapids, the 2030 District, and our equity partner, the Urban Core Collective, UCC. What's really important about the E.H.Zero project is that it's following the Zero Cities program, in which we're going to be able to find how best to suit Grand Rapids' needs by coming to zero carbon policies and programs together. And so one of the things that potentially is on the table is energy benchmarking and transparency, disclosure for a citywide progress tracking. So we're really looking forward to getting to understand what this is and how it can benefit Grand Rapids and what it has done around the cities for cities around the other nations. Other cities around this nation. So we're so excited to have Erin Bedingfield. She's the Associate Director of Codes and Policies of the New Building Institute. We also have Rajiv Ravulapati. He is he's the Program Manager of St. Louis, and he has gone through this process too for his city, and he can explain from his perspective how this was able to be rolled out and benefit the building owners who are in St. Louis, engaging in this sort of benchmarking and tracking. But before we begin, I cannot thank our sponsors enough. Between the Grand Rapids 2030 District and the City of Grand Rapids and the Urban Core Collective, our partnership is from support from Consumers Energy, DTE, Eagle, WEGI, and also the Kresge Foundation. So thank you so much, Erin. If you share your slides, we can take it away.
Great, thanks, Jillian. Can you see my slides all right?
I can.
Awesome, thank you. And hi, everyone. It's great to be with you. My name is Erin Bedingfield. I'm the Associate Director of Codes and Policy at NBI. If you're unfamiliar with our organization, we are a 501c3 nonprofit. We're based in Portland, Oregon. I'm based in Washington, D.C., but we have staff across the country, including in the Midwest. And we work on building performance. So we work with governments, utilities, efficiency advocates, building professionals in the real estate market to try to make buildings perform better from an energy and water use perspective. I am thrilled to be here with you talking about energy benchmarking and transparency, but I do want to highlight, because I'll catch myself as I'm talking, also talking about building performance standards, because benchmarking is a foundational policy that others are built off of. And so I just want to highlight for you that the folks at the 2030 District and USGBC have structured this agenda for you all in a way that makes a lot of sense. Today, we're talking about benchmarking and transparency. I'm going to try to stick with that. But your next session later this month is on building performance standards. And so you'll hear from Rajiv today. He has a great perspective of how those policies build off of one another. But I'll be going through today that sort of benchmarking transparency policy perspective. So a little bit of my plan for this discussion. I'm hoping to give you a presentation and then have an open dialogue toward the end of the call. I'll just do a 101 sort of benchmarking and transparency. What are we talking about? Where are we talking about this? What is the data that we are talking about? And then how can that information be used? How have other cities who have benchmarking and transparency policies in place used that information, and how have their real estate markets used it and benefited from it? I'll highlight some resources for follow-up information. So some other organizations that are doing great work on this, some links to information I'll share in my presentation, and then hopefully we'll have plenty of time for Rajiv to share his perspective and then for an open discussion at the end of the session. So just framing sort of existing buildings policies. We're talking about buildings that are already built, not ones that new construction codes would necessarily directly apply to. There are three buckets that I'm going to reference through my presentation of policy types. So benchmarking and transparency, what we're talking about there is a mandatory policy where building owners of commercial and or multifamily buildings over a certain size threshold. So in most cities, that's 10,000 square feet, 25,000 square feet. The larger buildings in a jurisdiction are reporting their energy use information that's pulled from utility bills. So you collect your monthly utility bills, put that into Energy Star Portfolio Manager, and then that's submitted to your jurisdiction. They report back out the whole building information. So the annual whole building data, and then some other building characteristics. So we'll talk about what data are included in that a little bit later. I'll also reference energy audit or retro commissioning policies. There are a few jurisdictions that have policies in place that require building audits or retro commissioning, and then some that require portions of that information to be reported. So New York is an example of that, where they have an audit and retro commissioning policy where building owners report certain characteristics of their building and certain energy conservation measures that have been identified by their auditor to the city, and then the city uses that information to design programs to support building owners. And then building performance policies, which will be discussed in detail later this month with this group. But what that is using building performance information and a threshold. So that threshold might be set as an energy use intensity or EUI. It might be set as an Energy Star score. It's just some way to measure building's performance. And then your building would be measured off of that. If you meet the threshold, you're compliant. If you don't meet the threshold, if you're not performing at the level that's identified, then some action is required. So either prescriptive action or improved performance on your own accord. That's kind of the idea with the building performance standard. So what we're talking about today is this first bucket, benchmarking and transparency, but I'll mention those other two probably during the course of talking about benchmarking. This graphic, if you've been working in this space for any period of time, you've probably seen it. It's from my colleagues at the Institute for Market Transformation. They do fantastic work and did pioneering work on benchmarking. I was there for 5 years working on benchmarking and transparency policy. And when I started, this map was much smaller. There were maybe 10 cities on the map, and now it looks like buckshot. There's policies everywhere. This is over 40 policies, 38 cities, 4 states, and they have some version of this benchmarking and transparency. So jurisdiction collecting that annual whole building information and then either making it public annually or making it public at time of transaction or otherwise. Sort of, there's nuance to each of these, but the general underpinning is these jurisdictions are collecting that information and giving it back to the market. So this is a highly generalized, and I want to triple underline, highly generalized version of how benchmarking policies work. So as I mentioned, the building owner collects their utility bills, so their energy, which is electric, gas, fuel consumption for the year. Usually that's monthly, and they input it monthly, and then it's aggregated annually. And then information about the building, so size, vacancy, other characteristics that go into Energy Star. And then sometimes water is also included in that. So water bills, monthly or quarterly, whenever you receive them. Those are sometimes also included in a benchmarking policy. Building owners put that information into Energy Star and then submit it. And the jurisdiction collects that information and then publishes it back out. So in theory, the jurisdiction would then give the information in a digestible way back to the market and then design programs and additional policies based on that information. And then the market would use that information in their transactional decisions. So building owners would then know, my neighbor is performing this way compared to me. I'm interested in buying this building. I want to know how it performs from an energy and water perspective. I'm interested in leasing space in a building. I want to know how it performs. It sort of overcomes that piece of the puzzle that's missing in those transactions. So from a general perspective, you're able to see how a building is performing from an energy and water perspective. So in doing those two things, in the local government's designing programs and policies, and in the market using information in transactional decisions, energy efficiency is incentivized. So buildings are, it becomes part of the conversation for buildings to become more energy efficient. And so they improve. And then the beat goes on. It's an annual cycle. So it happens again the next year and it continues. That beat goes on part, buildings becoming more efficient, is not automatic. So benchmarking by itself does not result in energy efficiency. The actions have to be taken by building owners or by cities to make buildings more efficient. So the act of benchmarking does nothing but make data available. You have to do something with that information. So I just want to underscore, while we're talking about benchmarking and transparency, this is a foundational policy. It's making information available. Something then has to be done with that information. So there are additional steps between benchmarking and high-performing buildings. The data that we're talking about, so often what's published by a city or a state is outlined here at a high level. I think you'll get a copy of these slides. You'll certainly get a copy of the recording of this presentation so you can pause and read the slide in detail. But generally what we're talking about is, where is the building located within the city? How big is it? How is it performing? So that might be its Energy Star score. It might be an EUI that's normalized. What that does is normalize the energy consumption of the building for its size. So it says per square foot, how much energy is this building used? using. There's also weather normalized EUIs. So according to this year that had this many weird days that made the weather result in different energy performance of the building, we need to normalize for that. And then there are also often GHG metrics. So what is the actual carbon use of this building? That is taking the energy and translating it into emissions. So the opportunity, why are jurisdictions passing benchmarking policies? Where is the opportunity? So the first is overcoming that information asymmetry, making building performance information available to the market so that policies can be designed off of it. We can understand how our buildings are progressing toward our climate goals, and we're able to incorporate that information into transactional decisions. It helps to design efficiency programs and target those at buildings that could most benefit from them. And then it can be used, as I mentioned, in real current local planning. So often if there's not a benchmarking policy in place, you're reliant on national data sets or on assumptions or on data that are derived. This provides local, actual, annual information about the building stock. So how can that information be used? I'm going to talk a little bit about how other cities are publishing the information, giving it back to the market, and then how they're using it in policy making and planning, and then some tools that the private sector can take the information they're already collecting, plug into these tools, and find out more information about how they can improve their buildings. So starting with giving the information back to the market, these are benchmarking maps. So in the early days of benchmarking, some of the cities that were first to pass it would publish spreadsheets of the data. So an output from Energy Star, one line is one building. You have basically, you know how to use Excel, or if you know how to manipulate data, you're able to get something from it, but it's not super useful for people who don't have time to dive into it. So in the last several years, cities have started to publish these in more intuitive maps. So you're able to interact with the data, you're able to see in the same way you would look at it on Google Maps, you're able to see your neighborhood and see what buildings are around you and sort of click in and out and see how they're performing. So that makes it a little bit more intuitive. You still have to reach out and find it and interact with it, but it allows you to understand that information a little better. So these are just some examples from Philadelphia, New York, and Boston. Their maps are great. They're kind of color coded where you can see performance is coded to a color. So you can quickly see where the high performing buildings are and where buildings that might benefit from some additional assistance are. There's also scorecards and infographics. So some jurisdictions will, upon submitting a benchmarking report, process that information and then send back out a scorecard. So if you're a building owner, you've given them your information, a couple of weeks or months later, you get back a scorecard that says, compared to similar buildings, same size, same general market sector, how is my building performing? How much might I save in terms of utility bills if I improve that performance? And then what are some additional resources that the city provides or that the utility provides or that otherwise are available to me that I can do something to take advantage of those savings? So that's scorecards. This is Seattle and Philadelphia, kind of their template scorecards. And then infographics. So this is a City of Chicago infographic that just sort of is a snapshot of how the city's building stock. So all the buildings that are subject to benchmarking are performing. So to quickly look and see how the building stock is progressing toward city climate goals. Another method for market engagement and outreach is physical building labels. So literally putting an Energy Star score or a building label on the building so that when you come into it, you're confronted with how it's performing. So this is New York City on the left and Chicago on the right, both of which have physical building label requirements. So they take the benchmarking data that are submitted to them, give the building owners back a label that contextualizes that information compared to peer buildings. So again, compared to similar size, similar market sector buildings, how is this building performing? And so that takes the information and you don't have to seek it out on a website. It's just available for folks who are using that building, coming in and out. They're either tenants or they're residents, and they're seeing that performance information. So it becomes a little bit more commonplace to start talking about it and internalizing it into the conversation. City planning and policy making. You saw that Chicago infographic communicating city progress. Can also be used in city level planning and evidence-based policy making. So we'll talk about a couple of those. These are examples of annual reports. So these are benchmarking reports, essentially a report of the program benchmarking, just to document its progress, provide summary information, document trends in energy, water, and water performance in the local building stock, and then communicate any insights that came up. So if you're seeing certain areas where there are a lot of buildings that could use some additional assistance, maybe you target a neighborhood resource to that segment of buildings. These are examples from Boston, Philadelphia, and Chicago. City level planning. So what you're seeing on this screen is not meant to be digested. The TLDR of it is that this is the District of Columbia's Clean Energy DC plan, and this predated, the city now has a building performance standard that they based off of their benchmarking data they had been collecting for several years. And they were able to segment by building type because they had benchmarking data. So some data segments that weren't available in national data sets, they were able to take actual real electric, natural gas, fuel oil consumption information from buildings located in DC and segment them out because they've been collecting that. And so they're able to plan a little more specifically to the actual conditions in DC. So what you're seeing here is just a table of EUIs and estimated energy consumption totals for different building segments. The lion's share of these came from benchmarking data. So this is EIA, the Energy Information Administration at DOE, the US Department of Energy, just acronym soup just comes out. And so one data line came from that. Most of the data lines came from benchmarking, and then a few came from direct city-owned buildings that they just had the access to the utility bill information that were large users in the city. And so they're able to use that to kind of say, okay, we know how much buildings are actually using within the city. How much can our reductions from buildings contribute to our citywide goals? So they're able to add that data to their alligator graph to understand how much of a segment would come from the building stock. And then evidence-based policymaking. So up at the top of the presentation, I mentioned that New York has a audit and retro commissioning policy in place where they collect some additional systems information about buildings. And so by doing that, they're able to say, we know certain buildings have certain system types. In New York, steam heating is a really big thing. So a lot of the large buildings have whole building steam systems, and they're able to collect information about how old those are, what the auditors are saying need to be improved, and then they're able to target programs. So New York has what they call the retrofit accelerator, which is a program to support building owners in improving their performance, and they're able to target programs that are designed around certain system types based on the information they're collecting. So they know they have a lot of this system type. A lot of the ECM, energy conservation measures or ECMs that come in are, this valve is old and needs to be replaced. They're able to do kind of steam upgrades based on the information they're collecting, for example. And then I also mentioned building performance standards. So a lot of jurisdictions that have had benchmarking policies in place for some time use those data to design their building performance standards. That's not necessarily a pre-step. You can do both in parallel, but it is helpful to have that local building stock information when designing a building performance standard. So you know what the building stock looks like and how it's using energy before designing that performance policy. Value to the private sector. So I know some of you likely submit your data to the 2030 District's voluntary benchmarking program. So you're already going through this process of collecting that information and submitting it. And you're like, okay, so what do I do with it? There are some things that a mandatory policy can help with. The first is that market context piece. So what are your neighbors doing? You have access to that information across the board rather than just the folks who are voluntarily submitting their information. What you're looking at here is the District of Columbia's benchmarking map, and the color coding is the performance of different buildings. So Energy Star score is color coded on this map. Red is a building that has a lower Energy Star score, which means worse performance in terms of energy use. And then blue is a higher Energy Star score, better performance in terms of energy use. And so you're able to see on that map which buildings are using energy well and which ones might benefit from an efficiency program or some additional support. If you click on a building, I just clicked on a random building. I don't know what's in 901 New York Avenue. I just clicked on one, but they blow out these little scorecards that tell you a little bit more information based on the benchmarking data. So if you were a building owner in that neighborhood, you're able to kind of look around at your neighbors and see how you're doing compared to them. Or if you're seeking space, if you're looking to buy a building or lease a building, you're able to say, like, all else held equal, I want a building that's performing better. And so I have that additional information. I'll also share, this is a tool that NBI has developed called First View, which takes monthly data, so the data that you're putting into a portfolio manager, not the annual data that are coming out from jurisdictions, but the data you're already collecting and putting in. And because it has monthly by fuel type, we're able to say, do some like rudimentary diagnostics. So you're able to look for anomalies in that information and say, like, hey, my heating system might need a tune up because I'm using a little bit more gas in the winter than I should be, or I'm using gas in the summer when I shouldn't be. This is one of the outputs, which just takes the energy use compared to the size, and then the size of the circle is the two things multiplied together. So a big circle is a big energy user because that's a large building with a large energy use per square foot. So this is a portfolio snapshot of a local jurisdiction's building data. You could do the same for a portfolio if you held multiple buildings within a city, or you could do it with the city's data if you had a mandatory benchmarking policy in place. This is another output of First View, so that monthly by fuel use data, and it just takes EUI, which is energy use per square foot, and total energy use, and maps them against one another by fuel type. So what you're doing here is just looking for anomalies. So here, where we have a library that has a really high use per square foot, if we were just looking at total energy use, which is on the right side, you'd be like, it's just a library, it's using not as much energy as this library, let's not pay attention to it. But when you look at it per square foot, you say, wow, that library is using a lot more per square foot than the other libraries. Like, let's take a peek at what might be able to be improved at that library. So a rudimentary first pass at, we need to take a deeper look at this building when you have information about a lot of buildings and you're able to compare them. And then building level diagnostics. So because you have monthly data by fuel type, you're able to map that, and then you're able to highlight certain things. So you can see on this slide, the numbers on the bullet lists correspond to the numbers that are labeled in the graphics. So you're able to look at cooling efficiency in the summertime. You're able to look at gas use in the summer. So this gray bar shows you basically the gas that your building's going to use year round, and you look for that to peak up or peak down. That's your thermal base load. Look at control issues when you're in the season where you're switching from heating to cooling. You're looking for any kind of noise there that might be a result of not the most efficient operation. Your plug load, which is this yellow bar across the bottom, things you're plugging into sockets or lights in your building, those are going to probably be mostly consistent for the whole year. Looking for heating efficiency in the winter time, number 5 here, and then noise. So where you see anomalies that aren't mapped to the heating or cooling, what you would expect energy use from those things, you're looking for what happened there. Was that a weather situation? Was that something happened in the building? Was it run during times when it shouldn't be? So it's a flag to be able to say, let's look again. It's not going to tell you what to do. It's going to tell you to do something, to look deeper and do something with that information. And then I mentioned the retrofit accelerator in New York. There are a lot of cities that have started to develop programming for their building owners based on benchmarking data. So they've said, you know, we have this information. We know building owners need some additional support to take action, to do something with this information. So they develop programs and develop resources to provide support. So it's not just here's this information, walk away. It's here's this information, and then here's some guidance and support and additional resources to help you improve the performance of your building. Some considerations in a benchmarking and transparency policy. These are self-reported data. So I talked you through the process of how it's done. You collect your utility data, put it into Energy Star Portfolio Manager, and then submit it. Anyone who's ever looked at a utility bill knows that it's not always a calendar month. There's some wiggle room around the sides of that. You need to get the dates plugged in right. You need to make sure you're not missing a decimal place when you're plugging this data in. So all of that allows for some error. So doing a data filtering on the city side to make sure the data are of high quality and anything that looks anomalous is followed up on, so that the data that end up getting published are accurate and folks are able to make decisions based on accurate data. Making sure it's accessible and clear. I talked about the early days when folks were publishing spreadsheets that weren't necessarily easy to interact with, making sure that the information is available understandable, and that you don't have to do too much seeking out to get it. So it's made available to you where you're at. And then making accommodations for under-resourced building owners. So folks who might not be able to make improvements or might even not be able to not have the resources to do the actual benchmarking, making sure that resources are available for those folks as well from the city side to ensure that they're able to participate in the program as well. And then what's next? So building additional policies off of that. So benchmarking and transparency is foundational to all sorts of programs, also foundational to a building performance standard. I wanted to highlight some resources for you all to follow up, get more information about some of the tools that I talked about, but also some of the programs and some resources that have been developed by cities that went before. So there were several projects of multiple cities that got together and sort of tackled these sticky issues on their own or as a unit and developed resources. So the City Energy Project was one of those, the American Cities Climate Challenge was one of those, and those groups of cities have published guidance and resources to help others to sort of follow in the footsteps without reinventing the wheel. So these are links, and I'll just scan through these quickly because you'll get them again. Links to First Fuel, which is that tool that does the diagnostics and the analytics that I talked about based on monthly data. This is a public buildings portfolio management implementation guide, which is benchmarking for city-owned assets. And Grand Rapids actually participated in that project. It was a DOE-funded project that we worked on with several cities, Grand Rapids being one of them. And so a lot of the lessons and learnings from managing a city portfolio and benchmarking a city portfolio's data are included in that guide. And then this is on our website. It's an interactive sort of how to design a building performance standard. So you can kind of play with what building type, what percentile you want based on that building type, and sort of design what reductions would look like for a building performance standard. These are resources from organizations that are working in this space. Portfolio Manager underpins every jurisdiction's benchmarking and transparency policy. So that's available through the US Environmental Protection Agency. The Department of Energy's Better Building Solution Center includes a lot of resources and guidance around benchmarking and transparency and policies that build off of it. I mentioned the City Energy Project. That was a group of cities that tackled benchmarking and transparency as a unit, and they have a resource library based on the information that they collected, the lessons that they learned. Benchmarking and transparency is prevalent in those resources. The Urban Sustainability Directors Network has a lot of resources on benchmarking and transparency and building performance standards. I mentioned my colleagues at IMT. While I was there, I led a project called Putting Data to Work, which tackled this question: what can be done with benchmarking data and what is next? And the output of that project was a toolkit of resources that included case studies, guidance for city policymakers, for utilities, for the private sector. And that is available at imt.org/puttingdatatowork. And then colleagues at Malka make a lot of data visualization and interaction software open source and freely available. And so that their website is a good place to go to kind of dive into what sort of software tools might you be able to use using benchmarking data and not really have to front a cost outside of your time or your staff's time. So with that, I think, yeah, discussion, that's my last slide. I'll just put my contact information up quickly so that you have it. It's just my first name, Erin, at newbuildings.org. I'm happy to answer follow-up questions offline and really looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Erin. That was a phenomenal conversation. Well, a phenomenal presentation. I'm looking forward to the conversation. So informative. And with us today, we have Rajiv Ravulapati, who is also with us from St. Louis. Thank you for coming on, Rajiv. I know it's a bit hour earlier for you in St. Louis than in Michigan. But, you know, St. Louis has gone through, like, is further along in the process than Grand Rapids is in transparency and BPS and all sorts of things. Rajiv, can you please like tell us the St. Louis's narrative from like beginning to present? How did St. Louis go about this, and what was your experience with it, with the building owners as well?
Sure, thanks, Julian, and good morning, everybody. Thanks for the opportunity to talk. Erin, it's good to see you. So yeah, the narrative of St. Louis. So again, my name is Rajiv Ravulapati. I'm the current program manager here for the city of St. Louis. I oversee a new office within the city of St. Louis called the Office of Building Performance. It's housed within our building division. We oversee our benchmarking policy and our building energy performance standards policy. So the narrative for our benchmarking policy began before I got hired. St. Louis is one of a couple other dozen cities that participated in the City Energy Project, which Erin mentioned earlier in her presentation. So in 2016, our building commissioner partnered with our local chapter of the USGBC. Our chapter is called the Missouri Gateway Chapter, and did a private-public partnership to apply for a city energy project. So benchmarking was born because of City Energy Project. The city got funding to work with stakeholders and the expertise of the partners within CEP to develop a policy, which was passed in 2017. And then I was hired as a technical advisor through City Energy Project to launch our program and begin the implementation. So we've had benchmarking since 2017. We work closely with our local chapter of the USGBC on all of our outreach and educational trainings for building owners. So they act a lot as our resource hub when it comes to benchmarking, and we act as that day-to-day implementers and working with building owners to help them comply and understand what's required of them for benchmarking. After City Energy Project ended, and we've been going through a couple of years of compliance with benchmarking, we've been thinking about what's the next iteration of our policy. Looking to our peer cities, we noticed, there are people doing, like Erin mentioned, prescriptive policies, audit policies, retro commissioning. There was a new philanthropic endeavor launched in 2018 called the American Cities Climate Challenge, which many of you may be familiar with. St. Louis applied for that as well and was accepted as an ACCC city. So using the partners within ACCC to work with our local stakeholders to develop that new generation policy, which ultimately became to be our BEPS policy, our building energy performance policy. We spent almost 2 years working with stakeholders on figuring out what is the right policy to be tailored here. Originally, when we were talking to stakeholders, we would meet with them pretty frequently. And what I mean by that, formally, working with the USGBC, we would have bi-monthly meetings, and then we would have separate offline meetings with our trade organizations. So BOMA, IFMA, IRM. We would have specialized meetings with our audit folks, with the audit community, engineers, architects, building owners themselves, real estate professionals, and a lot of folks related to affordable housing. And I'll get to that a little bit later. But like I said, we spent almost 2 years developing what should be our next policy. And our stakeholders definitively told us, or one sect that was rather vocal were the auditors and the contractors who are doing those ECMs, is don't go towards a prescriptive policy, go right to a performance standard, because looking at the past couple of years of our benchmarking data, our buildings, our property types compared to their national counterparts are severely lagging. So we have a lot of ground to cover to making them more efficient. So hence why we jump towards building performance policy. And that's where we are today. And we're beginning the implementation of that policy this year, now that we've got staff with our new office to help implement that policy. So that's the overall narrative for how we've gotten from benchmarking to where we are today.
Thank you for that. And the groups that you had mentioned, like the auditors, the folks who will do the ECMs, and the other trade organizations, those folks are on the call too. So it's great to know that we're engaging people early on this, and we're looking forward to individual conversation, just like St. Louis has had as well. And Erin, jumping off of St. Louis's story, you watched so many cities leverage transparency and benchmarking as a key feature of their building carbon reductions journeys. And so what are the commonalities and the unique approaches from designing and implementing benchmarking and transparency? How have how can other Midwest cities learn from what St. Louis has done and what has been done around the country?
Great question. So a lot of, if you think back to that map that showed cities and states, a lot of cities are passing benchmarking policies because cities are large collections of large buildings. And so buildings make up a large portion of the emissions within a city. So they need to tackle it. You can't do anything unless you know what's happening. So you can't manage what you don't measure, is the adage that you hear over and over. So the commonality in the passage of all of those has been the need to understand what's happening in buildings in order to help improve those buildings. And so some of the considerations that I mentioned at the end of my presentation, early on, it became clear that nothing was happening with information that was being published. It was, we are doing this, we're collecting it, we're making it available, and no one's doing anything with that information. So common need to make people understand what that data is, what it represents, and why it's important, why it matters to folks in the space where they are. They might not care about the city's climate goals. So how does it matter to them in their building? And how is it supportive of what they're trying to achieve within their building? How can you make their building perform better? How can you save them money? And then there's also the piece of making sure that information is high quality. So early on in the trenches of benchmarking, self-reported data is inherently, it has errors in it. So making sure that you're equipped to correct or follow up on errors where they exist, because it's really important that the data set be reliable and trusted if you're expecting people to do anything with it. And so the other commonality is that it is a base for program development. It's a base for additional policy development, like Rajiv said, building performance standards. And it's a base for utilities to have additional information about their end users. So they know where this building is, how big it is. Sometimes a building might have multiple utility accounts in it. And so all they know is their end use customer by account. They might not know that there are a bunch of accounts in a building and that building is humongous. It's not 5 different buildings. So being able to target their efficiency offerings toward building owners at the building level rather than at the account level. So there's a lot of nuance within cities. Different cities have different building types. I put DC's buildings up on the screen. You saw a bunch of federal government buildings and a bunch of embassies and a bunch of building types that are pretty unique to DC. If you fly into New York, you're going to see a lot of skyscrapers, a lot of really high-rise buildings that are pretty unique to New York. There are high-rise buildings everywhere, but the concentration is unique in New York. So, unique New York. And it was smooth. It was natural.
You did it.
But making sure that that the policy is catered to the needs of the local real estate market, because there are going to be unique building types everywhere. There's going to be concentrations of certain building types unique to your city. So making sure that it's also supportive of the real estate market within your jurisdiction.
You know, the uniqueness that you brought up at the beginning of this conversation, the E.H.Zero project started from the ending of the Zero Cities project. And something that we learned of the Zero Cities project that was unique to Grand Rapids compared to anywhere else is that 50% of our building stock is small single family homes. And there's no new land to construct new single family homes. Any new single family home will be actually a multifamily densification or redoing what is already a single family home. And that is that's something that was unique to Grand Rapids compared to every other Zero Cities project, and has affected the way that we approach our renewable energy goals, not renewable energy, our zero carbon goals. But you mentioned something interesting that, benchmarking and transparency sometimes comes from a citywide goal or sustainability desires from the built environment or from, the government. And Rajiv, St. Louis has been doing benchmarking and transparency for quite a while. What started St. Louis on this journey? Did you have a municipal-wide goal that galvanized you, or where did the inspiration come from to start in this journey in the first place?
Sure. We have been doing benchmarking for 5 years now, but certainly, we were like the phase 2 of cities doing this. Like DC's been doing benchmarking and since 2008, I believe, and New York's been doing it for a long time as well. The city does have climate goals. It has a decarbonization strategy. Our goal underneath the previous administration, Mayor Lyda Cruzan, the the goal change from reaching carbon neutrality by 2050. But these are non-binding resolutions that the city has, so it doesn't really have a lot of teeth. So I would say, it was born out of the city's overarching climate goals. The city of St. Louis's first sustainability plan was released in 2013, and then 3 years after that, they came up with a climate adaptation and action plan. And our sustainability director had worked with folks around the country and here locally on what kind of policies would be the most impactful for our community. Benchmarking was something that had been mentioned and talked about for a long time, but here at the city of St. Louis, unfortunately our Office of Sustainability and climate work here is done in a very limited scope. So a lot of the work that we've done from the municipal level has to be with private entities like groups like IMT or these philanthropic efforts, or partnering up with our local NGOs. So like when we saw that there was an opportunity to get funding to work on these kind of policies, because we don't necessarily have like those policy analysts or people working in this space day to day, like Aaron, we jumped at that opportunity so we could learn from it and then figure out as a way to learn from it, develop the policy, but also use their expertise and guidance on figuring out how can we do a lot of this work in-house so we can start staffing up people. I used to, up until last year, I was a one-man department overseeing our benchmarking policy, and now we've grown. We wrote into our building performance standards ordinance, there has to be this creation of this new office, the Office of Building Performance, which will manage and support the implementation and compliance of these policies going forward. And so now we're an office of 4. I still, would like to have more people, but I'm happy that we've grown from 1 to 4. But also it's been a catalyst. I would say benchmarking has been a catalyst for other policies, as well as other initiatives. So we've got benchmarking now, thanks to ACCC. We were able to hire a climate advisor to work on a solar readiness ordinance. St. Louis now has a solar readiness ordinance. We've got an EV readiness ordinance as well. Our Board of Public Service now has installed EV chargers at every municipal building in our benchmarking portfolio stock. Our threshold is 50,000 square feet and above. Sorry, I didn't mention that earlier, but that's kind of been what has kickstarted us getting to benchmarking, and then this ripple effect. And now with BEPS, we've got this new office, we've got this staff, but we're also following the model that you may have noticed with cities passing these type of BPS policy is, cities are the compliance hub, but building owners still need, guidance on all the resources available to them. So DC has launched a building innovation hub. New York has the building energy exchange. We actually, here in St. Louis, our local chapter of the USGBC is the umbrella organization for overseeing our equivalent of a resource hub. Ours is also called a building energy exchange hub. We co-license the branding with New York City as well as with Kansas City. So it's really exciting right now what's happening here in St. Louis. It's just, just a lot of work going forward, but we're excited to do it.
I love how you ended with that, because actually that was going to be a question I was curious about, is from the building owner side. They're working with the transparency and the BEPS for the office. Can you explain the building owner experience of working with the hub at the local USGBC in Missouri, and also working with your office? How, walking through their steps, what does that look like when they're looking for resources and guidance?
Sure. So, we have a dedicated benchmarking website. Like, that is our one-stop shop. We direct everybody towards that. But we have this internal proprietary CRM, customer relationship management tool, that we use that acts in a couple of different functions. It's our data warehouse. It's where we store all of our reported data with benchmarking every year, and it's how we run our analysis and create scorecards and everything. And it's how we communicate on a digital scale with building owners. With our USGBC, every year we work with them on creating a calendar of events, and it is almost a full year of calendar events, because between January and May 1 is our deadline for reporting for benchmarking data. So like I refer to that as compliance season. So we have these schedules of educational events for building owners, things like our benchmarking basic sessions, which go overview the law as well as how to set up a property, how to benchmark, and how to submit. We then also do these what we call carousel events, where after you've benchmarked, now what happens after benchmarking. So we'll partner with our local utilities, Ameren and Spire, on providing rotating educational sessions on their incentives. We'll do case studies from local building owners as well as auditors doing this kind of work. Now that we've got BEPS going, we're doing these carousel events on performance standards. So again, going over what's required of building owners on the law, because it's a much more complex, wonky law, but then also working with our audit folks and our energy service companies to help work with us on also communicating to building owners in addition to our mailings, using the USGBC to communicate with them as well. Like that's been the partnership and how we communicate with these folks.
For sure. And Aaron, nationwide, how have you seen things going?
Yeah, Rajiv and St. Louis are certainly leaders. New York and DC similarly. Some of the big cities that went first sort of have had more time to sort of digest the incorporation of data, what to do with it, how to interact with building owners. And so I would just say, in considering a benchmarking and transparency policy, you're building on the shoulders of giants. Lessons have been learned. People have established processes for doing this. And there will always be sort of a learning curve in terms of interacting with a local real estate market and getting folks comfortable with concepts and getting them comfortable with relationships. Folks, I'm sure at this point know who Rajiv is and know to reach out to him because he's been everywhere. I remember, Rajiv, in the early days, you were giving how to put data into Energy Star trainings to your building owners. So he was literally establishing relationships at the building level to get folks to trust that this was there to support them. It wasn't just going to be a policy that was passed and left to comply with, that the city was invested in making sure that building owners found success. And so I would just say that it's a similar trajectory in terms of setting up systems, putting them in place, establishing those relationships, and then building off of the policy. But a lot of that initial learning curve has been surmounted by cities before, and a lot of those cities have developed guidance or case studies or have folks who have gone through it and can provide sort of lessons or experiences that might help to sort of start further up the learning curve for folks who are newer to it.
And the only other thing I would add to what Aaron said is, like, we got a lot of inspiration and we have a lot of dialogue with partner cities. DC would be our closest partner, I would say, just because I'm regularly interacting with them. And they're some of their folks actually happen to be from St. Louis, so it just kind of was lucky in that regard. But they provided a lot of guidance, and specifically when it comes to the communication, like, we're doing all of this stuff because it falls within our overall decarbonization strategy. There are conscious building owners and engineers and staff and property managers who do care about that, and they'll act as a representative for the building owner when they're benchmarking. If you're an owner of a 50,000 square foot building, you certainly, you've got some wealth, and you can also, because of that, you can insulate yourself from directly interacting with these laws. So we're often dealing with property managers, auditors, third-party folks. And that's not to say that they don't care. In reality, some of them don't care. Some of them don't care about the climate goals. They're just trying to reach compliance, and that's fair. But in everything that we push out, we make sure that is part of our storytelling. I come from an organizing background. So like when I think of our communication arc, our story arc, that has to be at the forefront. But in terms of communication, like we have to build out, for cities who are looking to do this, like Grand Rapids or other folks on the call who are representing other cities, the education piece, I can't stress enough how important that is. Like we took 6 months ahead of our your 6 months just to develop our education strategy, and then we did a 6-month period of getting ready to notify building owners and here's what to expect. So for some that might be overkill, but for us here in St. Louis, this is a brand new law. We had to build up all these systems in order to get building owners to comply. So that education piece is, will need some critical thinking and some partnership.
And thank you for that. Thank you, Rajiv and Aaron. And so diving a little bit deeper into the building owner's experience and going through this, you're talking about case studies and like the results from this sort of thing. Can you speak to some of the case studies that you've seen and what have been some quantifiable differences while just benchmarking, or maybe benchmarking paired with other interventions that folks are going through?
Well, I can say from the municipal side of things, so our ordinance, municipal buildings have to comply with both benchmarking and BEPS. I remember, our municipal buildings, we actually have, we here in St. Louis, we have a very old existing building stock. We've got a lot of buildings from the early 1900s, in fact, going to the mid to late 1800s. Last year I was living in a cottage in a neighborhood in Benton Park. That cottage was built in 1870. So we have a lot of old residential and commercial building stock. A lot of them actually a lot of our existing buildings actually are pretty efficient. This building that I'm in right now, City Hall, complies, and it currently has a 78 Energy Star score. After seeing our benchmarking data and sharing that with our Board of Public Service, they oversee our facilities division. They handle all the utility accounts. One immediate impact was, working with our facilities division on assessing our own buildings and what can be improved. At the state, we have a division of energy, and they have this revolving loan fund for schools, NGOs, and governments to use funding for these for ECMs or for clean energy projects. And so one of the first things that our facilities team did after looking at our data is applying for that revolving loan fund. And in the fiscal year of 2018, I believe, we got granted $1.7 million to do retro commissioning on 4 of our most energy consuming buildings. So that was one immediate impact that happened here to our own buildings within the first year of benchmarking.
Dang. And the building owners who are complying with this and who are speaking with your offices or the offices that you've seen around the country, Aaron, there are some folks who are very excited about these opportunities to engage and support their existing sustainability goals or the other priorities that they have internally. Can you speak to some fears and hopes and what building owners were experiencing before they started with this policy and how they feel now going through it for a few years? Either of you can answer that one, I assume.
I think there's an adjustment to any policy, that any regulation, if you're having to comply with it annually, you have to file your taxes every year. You don't super dig filing your taxes, but you have to file them. So you adjust to the fact that you have to file your taxes. So folks adjust to the fact that they're benchmarking. And then as programs and policies are built off of that, and as data are made more available and folks see the value of that information being made available, the market starts to adjust. So it's not an automatic thing. Benchmarking is passed and then people know this data is available and they know what to do with it. That's not a one-in-one thing. It's an on-ramp that I've talked about a few times, but markets, as they start to mature, I'll call it a benchmarking market, as it matures, starts to use that information both on the city side and the market side, and folks adjust to that annual compliance and they understand why they're doing it. If they don't super agree with it, they at least understand why they're doing it. And then most come around to understanding that it's helping to improve the performance of their building. So it's helping them to save on utility bills. It's helping them to create a market edge in making their building high performing and recognized as high performing. I don't know, Rajiv, if you have direct building experience.
Could you say what was the question one more time, Jillian?
In your experience, you have folks who were hesitant about the
Uh,
policies and who were supportive of the policies. And can you explain from their experiences?
Yeah, I think for us, I mean, I completely agree with Aaron. It's just like it's something brand new. There's like some panic from the start, but then eventually they adjust. I think, I've been working for government for 5 years, and I used to work um, on the lobbying side of things too. And people just have this perception that government, they overreach, or they're trying to make things harder for you, but it does have a certain role. But taking that perception, be it, false in a lot of aspects, taking that perception into account here locally, especially, we knew it would be important to, make sure that we have all of our outreach and education programming from a third party, from a non-governmental entity. So that would, in our case, like trying to alleviate some fears or some trepidations building owners have about the policy. Our USGBC here has a really good reputation. Our building division here has a really good reputation of working with building owners for a lot of the processes. So like that reputation of our building division and our USGBC was very helpful in getting building owners to understand why we passed this policy, as well as why do they needed to comply.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That trust, that community trust, is so valuable, and I think we're fortunate that the 2030 district has had a longstanding in Grand Rapids for that reason as well. So moving to how transparency connects with BPS and what sort of quantifiable successes we've been able to see from this. Can you speak to the estimated GHG reduction citywide that the combination of BPS and transparency has had, and how transparency complements other initiatives?
What I'll speak on for St. Louis is, so, that's one thing that we have not, when we were part of ACCC, we've done updated greenhouse gas inventories, but we weren't able to do an assessment of like what this policy will do for potential greenhouse gas reduction. So that's something our office is going to build out as our implementation carries on. It's actually one of our main projects, is providing that objective evidence, subjective in some ways, but like providing as much clear hard data to them on understanding the carbon benefits as well as the monetary benefits. Building owners just really care about their bottom line, but if we can show them how that bottom line can translate to carbon savings for your buildings, I think that would be really impactful here. We haven't done those kind of studies, but it's something that we're trying to do going forward.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I'll just say it's going to depend. That's like the answer to everything. It depends, but it's going to depend on the jurisdiction's building stock and where that threshold is set. So each jurisdiction is going to decide, we're going to measure based on Energy Star score, we're going to measure based on carbon emissions, we're going to measure based on EUI, and then where to set that threshold. So do you set it at the 50th percentile? Do you set it at the 60th or 70th?
Mm-hmm.
I'll flag in my slides that tool I showed where you can kind of play with building type and percentile. Helps as an estimate for carbon savings, but it helps you to kind of cater a potential BEPS policy design to your building stock, building type, and percentile to get an idea. But it's really going to vary, and it's going to change over time, because a threshold stays, especially if it's a percentile, and you say buildings that are in the bottom 50th percentile need to get themselves up to this performance number. The next time a BEPS cycle happens, so a 5-year performance cycle, the next year those buildings have performed better, so that 50th percentile performance has gotten higher, and so buildings are increasing or ratcheting up. And so where you set that threshold is really going to impact how much savings you see over time.
And to that note, I know that St. Louis has 4 options for connecting with folks who are trying to reach their goals in BEPS. in a high level before we wrap up. Can you explain those?
Yeah, absolutely. So our BPS policy affects the same covered buildings list, 50,000 and above. And, we know, we understand that like every building is unique and every building is access to capital, access to staff, their tenants are different. There's this whole host of variables that a building owner has to deal with in trying to meet a standard. We are very aware that a building may not be able to reach their target by the end of a compliance cycle. Here with our policy, most buildings have to comply by 2025 to meet the target. Qualified affordable housing and houses of worship have till 2027 to meet their target. So our first one is just called our performance pathway. These first two pathways I'll talk about are performance based, and then we've got these two that we call alternative compliance pathways. So performance, if you are currently at the BEPS, at the target for your property type, you just have to maintain that level of performance and you're compliant. To incentivize building owners doing deep energy retrofits, we've got this other performance pathway that we call early adopters, where you're at the target for your building type, but if you are able to reduce it by an additional 20%, you'd be compliant for cycles 1 and 2. Or if you go even exceed expectations and reduce your consumption by an additional 50%, you can be in compliant for cycles 1, 2, and 3. So really long-term compliance. So that's meant to incentivize building owners to invest in their buildings now for a long-term compliance, because building owners love having certainty. So like this is a way to try and incentivize and build in that certainty. So if you can't reach the target, we understand that. Then we have these non-performance pathways called alternative compliance, where if the target's unachievable for you, you can try and narrow the gap. That's our first alternative compliance pathway, where if you can cut 50% of the difference between the baseline and the current performance. So let's say the target is 50, your building's currently operating at 100 site EUI. Can you get to a 75 by the end of the cycle? And it's up to you you have the flexibility on doing whatever improvements you want, so long as you narrow the gap to that interim target. If that's still too aggressive for you, then there's a custom option, but this is where it gets a little more stringent and there's more verification requirements for both of our alternative compliance pathways, but specifically for the custom, you have to get an ASHRAE level 2 audit done, submit the results of that full report to our office, and there has to be an agreement between the city and the building on what ECMs you're going to do, and that those proposed ECMs have to be completed by the end of a compliance cycle. And then there's going to be interim milestones that you'll have to hit for whatever ECMs you're getting done. So right now we're building out what we call a BEPS dashboard that building owners will use and interact to submit these plans and to comply with our policy overall. So those are our 4 pathways at a very high level.
It seems that you're really meeting building owners where they're at to try to help them reach these goals. So something that we really admire about St. Louis. And so before we wrap up, these final thoughts, final takeaways. So Erin, if you were to drive one clear message home about transparency and benchmarking, what would you say to our audience?
I'm gonna make it a 2-parter.
Yeah.
First, that it's important information for the market and that it's foundational to a lot of policies and programs, and that it's key to get it right in terms of data quality, data accessibility, and availability. And then second, that you are not starting this from scratch. Many other cities have passed these policies and have learned lessons the hard way and documented those. And so use the resources that are available. They were published for this circumstance for a city that hasn't done this yet, but is looking to do it. And they're catered toward that audience. So the resource page that I flagged at the end of my presentation has a lot of guidance. I can also provide specific guidance, but I would just say it's really important to make this information available and reliable and accessible. And you're not doing this from square one.
Love it. Rajiv, final thoughts as you're heading out for the webinar?
Final thoughts, yes. Well, just to piggyback on what Aaron said, so like making that data publicly available is really thinking about, the audiences who will use that data. So like here, our utilities, our contractors, the auditors, the engineers, architects, they crave that information so they can use it for obviously their own self-interest purposes for business development, but they can try and push their clients to do this kind of work. And now that there are these mandates here in the city of St. Louis, it gives them more ammunition to work with these clients on getting that done. When it comes to benchmarking and transparency, the data quality is really, really important. I think Aaron had it in our early slides that the benchmarking data is foundational to any cities who's pursuing some type of BPS policy. So you've got to make sure that your data is accurate and it's reliable in order to create standards that you're going to mandate to these building owners. So that data quality is very, very important. And that goes back to the whole education piece of working with these building owners so they know how to benchmark and they know how to resolve data quality issues. That's something that we do a lot with during the compliance season, is when we're regularly overseeing our submissions coming in, flagging which buildings have those data quality issues and following up with them as best we can through our help desk and with our USGBC. So that foundational benchmarking data is very important for whatever policy Grand Rapids or any other cities on the call are looking to move towards.
Thank you, Rajiv. And then honestly, thank you so much, St. Louis and the New Building Institute too, because as Grand Rapids is looking to find our city's carbon reduction journey, it's so helpful to have cities who be able to mentor us and do it before us, and thought leaders like IMT and the New Building Institute to be able to direct us to the resources, the tried and true lessons learned and successes, and ways that we also can have a very similar successful experience. So energy benchmarking and transparency is available voluntarily through the Grand Rapids 2030 District. You'll be receiving an email later, folks, from us on how you can get involved with what we have available, how you can learn more about this project, and our resources page, which has tons of IMT and New Building Institute, Architecture 2030, all sorts of guidance on it. And we're happy to send you to anything specifically you're looking for. If you take a look in the chat, you'll see that the most recent link was our survey. We send that to you every time because we really care about what you thought about this presentation and what more presentations you want to see. As you saw in the beginning of Aaron's presentation, you saw that this is part 2 of a 6 series with additionals. If you have topics that you want to learn deep about, we'll be able to bring those resources to you. So to learn more about the E.H.Zero project, which is equitable, healthy, zero carbon buildings, policies and programs will be coming in a year or two to Grand Rapids and affecting the building community here. You can connect with me at Jillian at USGBC-WM, or Jen Spiller also is with the City of Grand Rapids, similar to in Rajiv's situation. And you can connect with her at jspiller@grcity.us. Any further questions, you can get a hold of us. And we're so grateful to have you here today. So without further ado, have a lovely day. And thank you so much, Aaron and Rajiv, for spending the time with us to learn from your experiences.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you. Have a good day, everybody.
Thank you.